So when we started this sermon series a couple of months ago, I came with a list of things that I wanted to talk about, things that I had encountered as a pastor that were myths and misconceptions and misunderstandings. And I have now run through the list of what I started with, but also when we began, I asked you as the congregation if you had things that you wanted to talk about, things that you wanted to share, ideas and scripture that you wanted to look at, to let me know. And so for the rest of this sermon series, that's what we're going to do, is talk about things that you guys have asked about. Now this particular myth, misconception, or misunderstanding this morning is one that was asked for by a couple of members of the congregation. Let me go ahead and drop out a caveat before we dig into things this morning. This topic may stray over to politics just a little bit. And I know that that topic is polarizing. It's why I wanted to let you know ahead of time, especially in the world that we live in today where there are so many things happening and so many thoughts and ideas. So this morning I'd ask you to be patient. Be willing to listen this morning. And if you have any issues with what we're talking about, please come and talk to me. I'll buy the coffee. We'll sit and we'll share. Now, with that out of the way, what we're talking about this morning is a topic that fits into all three categories of this sermon series. It is a myth, misconception, and misunderstanding. This topic is an overachiever. Today we're going to look at the idea that God appoints or sets into place our leaders in government. And so we should all be obedient to them, because if we are not, we are actually disobeying God's will. Now there are a few scriptures that might get used to prop this idea, but there is one that is more used than any other. To be honest, I don't know that there is any more abused scripture that has been used to abuse people in all the Bible. Romans 13:1 says this: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God." Now, I just shared with you before the scripture that this is abused scripture that has been used to abuse others, and I want to give you a brief history of what that looks like so you don't think I'm making it up this morning. In 1933, shortly after the Nazis had come to power in Germany, the people were not really sure if they were digging what Hitler and the Nazi Party were trying to do. They thought maybe it was a little too brutal, that things were a little off. And so they looked to their religious leaders. And Protestant theologian Otto Dibelius stood in front of a newly elected German parliament, stood in front of the people, and shared this verse to say why Christians should support the government in everything that they do. During the American Revolution, loyalists to the king used the scripture to prop up why the American colonists should be obedient to the king. During the Civil War, slave owners used the scripture to legitimize slavery in the South. Starting in the late 40s and early 50s, all the way through in South Africa, the Dutch Reformed Church used the scripture to pop up and justify apartheid. In 2018, the U.S. government used the scripture to support a policy that separated children from their families at the border. Now look, we could keep going with examples about how the scripture has been used to do some heinous things in human history, but at the end of the day, they all seem to come down to the same thing. People in power attaching God to themselves and their actions by suggesting it was God who put whatever leader in place, and then using that scripture to validate the horrible things that they are doing, the horrible laws that they're putting into place, the things that cause harm to other people created in the sacred image of God. And looking at this scripture, it is always important, like I've shared many times from this pulpit before or in classes and studies, we have to answer the questions of who, what, when, where, and why as much as possible. And in this scripture, who it was written to is probably the most important thing. This scripture was not written to Germans in 1933, or to South Africans in the 40s and the 50s, or to Americans in the 21st century. This scripture was written by Paul to Christians living under Roman rule, hence the name of the book. That's one of the mistakes that we tend to make as Christians when we read scripture today, is that we read it as though it's written to us, and it's not. There is no piece of scripture that is written to us. Scripture is written for us. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. When you look through scripture, there are names in the book. There's Romans, there's Thessalonians, there's Ephesians. Those are all addressed to a certain group of people at a certain time. And you look at the Old Testament, that is explaining what's going on with God's chosen people. We need to understand the things written were written to them in their context, in their cultural setting. And so we need to figure out what it meant to them so then we can take out what it means for us. And so in this particular scripture, as Paul is writing to people under Roman rule, we need to understand that both Jews and Christians weren't super happy with what Rome had going on. But things hadn't gotten horrible yet. Nero is the emperor at this time, but he is still sitting under the wise teachings and the empathetic and compassionate teachings of certain philosophers. He hasn't started the prospect of torturing and persecuting people. We need to know that when Paul says that the governing authorities were instituted by God, and so people should submit to them, it's essentially a reminder that the people need to keep in mind always that it was God who set human authority over each other into motion. The idea of authority is God's. The authority that we are given comes from God. The law that we base authority on is God's. We see this with Adam and Eve being put in charge of everything. I mean, that's what we're told is God had Adam and Eve out of the garden. He said, everything is yours. You're in charge of it. Take care of it. We see this again with God choosing and sending Moses to lead the people. And even more so we see this with the institution of the kingship with Saul that God also sets into motion. And so as Paul writes these words to early Christians who aren't necessarily persecuted yet, but also aren't happy with what's going on, he's telling them, look, the authorities that are in place over you, the authorities that exist, the laws that exist, submit to those as best you can. Understand that God is the one who created, who instituted authority, but God is not the one who perpetuates authority. God is not the one who consistently chooses leaders and authority. God is the beginning point of human authority, but not the sustainer of human authority, if you will. It's important to keep in mind that this authority was meant to be built on the statutes and directives of God, of which the primary trait was love. Paul says this a few verses later in Romans 13:10. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is fulfilling the law. Love is how Jesus sums up what it means to follow the law in Luke 10. We know that scripture, right? Jesus is there and he is teaching, and somebody comes up and wants to know, how do they keep all of the law? What does that look like? What's the most important? And Jesus' answer is one that every church knows. Everybody who has been raised in the church knows. We're aware of it. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. In the context of this Romans 13:1 scripture on leaders and authority, we must read it in the light of the primary attribute of the law, love. It's meant to be read through the lens of love of God and love of neighbor. So that means a couple of things for us as Christians living today. First up, we always need to keep in mind that this system of governance that existed in biblical times was kingships, empires, tribal chiefs. You cannot take the scripture and apply it to a system of governance where the leadership and authorities are voted for by the people and are not appointed. And if those people that are voted on and appointed to these positions of authority and leadership take actions and enact laws that are unloving, that is, laws that cause harm and dehumanize others, that is, laws that break down others, that is, laws that cause others to suffer and makes them seem less than who God made them when God created them, envisioned them, and breathed life into them. If they enact laws that are unloving and do these things, we are meant to resist them. We are meant to speak up. We are meant to point it out. We're meant to see when these laws and leaders do these things and say, wait a minute, that's not right. Don't do that. Don't do something that is causing this harm, that is tearing somebody down. As the people of God who live under this law of love God and love your neighbor, we are meant to point out when things are not going that way. what Scripture pushes towards is that we should submit to our leaders and authorities. That is part of what it means to be a people of God. We should do that until they are no longer worthy. Until they're no longer worthy of that submission. And then we are meant to stand against them. Because the authority and the law of God, this law of love, is greater than any authority or law of humanity. And before anyone gets upset or distressed, what I'm getting at, there is a biblical precedent to this idea. We've got Moses and Pharaoh. We've got Moses, who is chosen and sent by God and rolls into Pharaoh's throne room and says, essentially, let God's people go. And we have the 10 plagues. Moses stands up against a leader who is unloving to the people. We have Esther and King Xerxes. Remember, in Esther's day and time, it was illegal to come into the presence of the king, and yet she did that anyway. She showed up, she goes, and she speaks up for God's people. Oh, we have a story that many of us have learned as children. I think there's even a song that goes with it about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the Persian rulers who said, look, this is how we want you to live now. This is how we want you to eat. These are the gods we want you to worship. And they said, no. We're not going to do that. We have Elijah and Queen Jezebel. The queen was coming in and trying to institute a new kind of worship to new gods. And Elijah stands up against it and says, no, that's not who God made us to be. That's not what it means to love God and to love others. We have John the Baptist and Herod. As John stands up against Herod leading the people away from God. We have Jesus and Pilate and Herod, as both Pilate questioned Jesus and asked Jesus some things, and Herod wanted Jesus to do some tricks and party favors, and Jesus told them both, no. That's not what it means to be a person of God. That's not what we're meant to do. You have the disciples and pretty much all of the religious rulers and teachers of the day. If you go and read the history of the disciples, they went all over the place, and most of them died horrible deaths. Because they stood up to authority and they stood up to leaders to enact and to live this law of love. And then you have the people that Paul is writing to. These early Christians who eventually will suffer persecution for a couple of things. One of them is for living a life that is opposite of Roman law. Roman law basically said, take what you can take, get what you can get. Might makes right, power is important. Early Christians come along and say, no, we're going to give. We're going to look out for each other. We're going to take care of one another. I'll give what I have so you can have. And so they were breaking Roman law. They were breaking Roman ideals, but also they refused to worship the emperor as the Son of God. They said no. They stood up in support of this law of love. The next thing that we need to embrace is the idea of a constant attribute of God. There are things that we talk about that are attributes of God that don't change, and that main one is called immutability. Immutability is the idea that God does not change, so God never contradicts God. And so if there are leaders and authorities in place that do not govern in such a way that point back to loving God and loving others, I want to share with you as a thought, they were not appointed by God. They were not set into those leadership roles by God. We do see several places in Scripture where God is not the one who puts people in authority. We see this in 1 Samuel and in Revelation 13, that people end up in authority positions that God didn't put there, other forces did. I want to share with you this morning, if you're not sure whether a leader is of God or not, I point you exactly one book of the Bible from this one. Go from Romans 13 to 1 Corinthians 13. And we get a fantastic description of what love looks like. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no records of wrongs. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, and hopes all things, and endures all things. If the leader you're looking at doesn't fit that description, again, I'd argue that leader is not appointed or set in place by God. If you take nothing else away from this message this morning, please take this. The law of love is what is supposed to be the overriding directive for all those that claim Christ. That is the directive of God that supersedes any human authority, and that all authority it claims to be from God must abide by. So this morning, I'd encourage you. I don't know where you sit with this scripture. I don't know what you understand about this scripture, but spend time. Spend time seeking God out. Spend time in the scripture looking at it for yourself. Spend some time contemplating. Because this is something that we need to share. This is something that, as the people of God, we need to be sharing in all the places that we can. That there is a law of love that we are meant to live by. And if our leaders and authorities are going to attach God to what they're doing, they must also live by it. And if they're not, then we are meant to resist. We're meant to be the ones who stand up and say, it doesn't matter what you're saying. It doesn't matter this law you're trying to enact. We love God. We love people. And everything we do has to come from that place.